Did you hear about the drive-in Hanukkah celebration that the Rivertowns Chabad is doing? Well, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No, I have not heard.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. I just saw it briefly today, but yeah, so there's going to be entertainment and all sorts of things. I thought your family might like it.
Great, that's great. I'll look into it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's coming up. Hanukkah's coming up sooner than later. It's early this year, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump right in. We don't have too much, we don't have an unlimited amount of time. We're going to do a full book today, not because we have all that time, because it's the shortest prophet. The Haftorah is an entire book. It's the book of Ovadia. So if you look at the prophets, the later prophets, the way they're referred to, are combined in a book called Treyasar, which literally means 12. But really, each one is its own book of the Bible. And the shortest book of the Bible is the book of Ovadia, which we're going to read today. We read the Haftorah for the Shabbat, 21 verses. That's the whole story. Now, Ovadia is unique because his prophecy is not directed to the Jewish people. Usually the prophets, overwhelming majority of cases, the prophecies are for the Jewish people. And there are some prophets who also refer to the surrounding nations. But I would say other prophet would, in amongst 50 chapters, they would mention 3-4 about the Gentiles. Ovadia, the entire book of Ovadia, is directed to the nation called Edom. And of course, we're involved because it's about the Jewish people, but the prophecy is about Edom. Who is Edom? So Edom is the kingdom that was south of Israel, southeast of Israel, in modern day Jordan, southern Jordan. And Edom is considered to be the descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother. And therefore, in this week's Parsha, we read about the unification of Esau and his brother after how many years? After 20 years. And it's a very moving story because they have an emotional reunion, Yaakov and Esau. They have a very emotional reunion. And you look at them and it looks like, wow, the brothers got together and now they're going to live happily ever after until the end of times. But unfortunately, that's not the way it turns out. They separate, right? Because they say, now we're coming from Thanksgiving. This year, Thanksgiving wasn't so complicated. But every year on Thanksgiving, before Thanksgiving, I drive around town, I turn on the radio. All I hear about is how are you going to survive Thanksgiving dinner with your relatives? This is like a crisis. It's like the whole America. All they want to know is about how do you cook turkey and how do you survive Thanksgiving with your relatives. It's a big deal. Like they say, that it's a big blessing is to have a large family that live far away in a different city. So Yaakov and Esau can get along because Esau moves out of town. And that's what we're going to read on. That's what we read in this week's Parsha. And we'll discuss it on Thursday, God willing. But it's clear in the Torah that he moves to Har Seir. He moves to Mount Seir. Mount Seir is the land of Edom. And the brothers part. And in their lifetime, it's the end of the story. But in history, the way history unfolds, there's a constant conflict between Yaakov and Esau. In other words, their descendants, which is Israel and Edom. And that's why it's a little bit hard to place this Haftorah. Where is it referring to? Because there's so many options when it could be referring to, because there was so much conflict between the two brothers. And that is something that we are going to think about even before we get to the Haftorah. That's sort of the introduction. Now, when brothers fight, unfortunately, sometimes when brothers fight, the fight is more severe than when strangers fight. Because if I don't get along with a stranger, or a stranger is mean to me or cruel to me, I don't necessarily have any expectations, so I'm not that hurt. But if a person has a brother, and with the brother there's expectation of respect and an expectation of love, so when that expectation is not met, then the pain is so much greater. And one way to think about this is, we're going to get to it in the beginning of the Haftorah. when the prophet refers to Edom, he is referring to Edom just as a regular nation. In other words, he's not focusing on the fact that Edom is our brother. And he just talks about what the prophets would tell other nations as well. Tell them not to be so arrogant, etc., etc. Don't worry. The story of every empire is that when they're at their height, they think that they are invincible. And they think that they are invincible, and therefore the prophet comes and tells them that don't be so arrogant because nobody's invincible except for God. And that's the beginning of the Haftorah. But then once you get to about verse 9 or 10, depending on who you ask, maybe 8, now it shifts. And what happens in at the second half of the Haftorah, now we refer to Edom and we say, you are our brother. And therefore the expectations of a brother is much greater. And therefore the pain when the brother stands by and doesn't help is much more profound. And that is what we're going to be talking about. Now, the sages understood that Edom, which is again the country that's southeast of Israel, the sages understood that Rome was the heirs of Edom. In other words, Rome was founded. It's not clear how Rome was founded. If you look at the history of Rome, there's all kinds of theories. But from the Jewish perspective, some of the descendants of Esau moved to Rome and they participated in the founding of Rome. So Rome, from the perspective of the sages, is the spiritual heir of Edom. And therefore, the entire exile, the second exile, in other words, the exile from when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the first century, that's considered the exile of Rome. And the sages say that's the continuation of the conflict between Jacob and Esau. And then after Rome falls, Rome becomes Western Europe. And in some sense, the sages saw the terrible exile that we experienced as the conflict between Jacob and Esau. The good news is that at the end of time is going to be just like in this parsha, right? You think about Yaakov and Esau, the people and their family, and then how it plays out in history. So in their family, there's conflict, and then they meet up. The meeting is not final, but they meet up. History too. The story is complete. Eventually, at the end of the Haftorah, Jacob and Esau meet up. And even though the verse doesn't say so explicitly, but from the Kabbalistic perspective, implicitly, the verse is saying that they're united once again. So I guess, despite all the pain and despite all the suffering, there is going to be this reunion. But what we want to do is I want to begin by introduction. I want to bring up here a verse from this week's parsha, and see this exact point, how Jacob and Esau meet and how they depart, and how Jacob basically says, you know what, I'm going to meet up again. We're going to meet up again. So, and then we're going to read the Haftorah and see how that plays out. So I'm going to try to share the screen if I can. This one is it. Okay, I'm not sure what I'm sharing right now. I don't know which screen I'm sharing, but okay.
You're sharing your Google Doc.
My Google Doc. Okay, that's not going to help anybody now.
Could you actually put the URL in the chat window?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll stop the share. We will get this URL. Okay, so this is the URL, not of the Haftorah, but of one verse that I want to show from the Parsha as an introduction to the Haftorah, provided I can pull this up here. I'm going to make one more shot at this. I'll take one more shot at this. Okay, what am I reading now? No, Torah reading for Vayishlach. I want to share this guy. Okay, you know what? I'll close everything else down. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Window is closed. Okay. Okay, how about this? I think I share this.
Yep, we see it.
Okay. So here we go. This is the end of it, toward the end of this week's parsha. Now, the beige or the gray, whichever color you're seeing here, is Rashi. So what I'm going to try to do for a second, I'm going to close the Rashi just to make it easier to read. So they meet up. Jacob and Esau meet up. Vayomer, thereupon he said, verse 12, chapter 33, verse 12. Thereupon he said, who said? Esau says, travel and we will go and I will go alongside. Esau says, we met up. Why don't we travel together? We'll find a place to go together. What does Jacob say? Jacob says, not a good idea. Why? I have a lot of children. It takes us a long time to travel. Why don't you go first and I will come after you? That's what Jacob says. And he said to him, verse 13, and he said to him, Jacob tells Esau, my master knows that the children are tender, and the flocks and the cattle which are raising their young depend upon me. And if I override them one day, all the flocks will die. I can't push them. Verse 14, now let my master go ahead before his servant, and I will move at my own slow pace, according to the pace of the work that is before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my master to Seir. So Jacob says, Esau says, why don't we go together? Jacob says, I can't. I have too many sheep. I have young children. We're going to go slow. Eventually, I'll catch up to you. Thereupon Esau says, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But Jacob says, why do that? May I find favor in my master's eyes. So Esau returned on that day on his way to Seir. Sounds so beautiful. Two brothers, one invites the other one home. So Jacob says, I'm coming soon. I'll get there soon. I'm going slowly. I'll get there soon. What's the problem with this verse? The problem with this verse of verse 14 is that Jacob never goes to Seir. He says, I'm coming, but he doesn't show up. For all we know, Esau is sitting in Seir for the next 30 years waiting for his brother to show up. So Jacob doesn't show up. So why doesn't Jacob show up? So now we need to look at the Rashi. Says Rashi, why doesn't Jacob show up if he says he's coming? So this is a fascinating Rashi. The first interpretation of Rashi is, this is good advice. And if you're afraid of somebody and the guy asks you, where are you going? Say you're going further. If you're only traveling to New Jersey, say I'm traveling to Kansas City. Why? In other words, you're allowed to play with the truth for protection. Why? Because if you expand your journey, the guy will say, okay, I'll fight him later. I'll hit him later. But if you tell him where you're going, then you're putting yourself in danger. That's the first interpretation of Rashi. So the first interpretation of Rashi is Jacob never intended him going to Seir. He was afraid of Esau, even though they had a momentary reunion, but Jacob was still afraid of Esau. So therefore, he never intended to go. It was a lie or a white lie. Call it what you want. So that's the first interpretation of Rashi. If you see where I'm pointing here, until I come to my master to Seir. Says Rashi, he told him of a longer journey. Although he intended to go only as far as Sukkot, he said to himself, if he intends to harm me, he will wait until I come to him. But he did not go to Seir. That's the first interpretation. Jacob is afraid, so he has to change the truth. Second interpretation. So when will he go? In the days of the Messiah, as it is said, Ovadia 121, the final verse of our Haftorah, and Savior shall ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau. There are also many midrashic interpretations of this section. Bottom line is this. Of course, Jacob is going to go meet up with Esau. Of course, they're going to have a reunion. When is the reunion? Well, it may take a few thousand years. Okay. So when Jacob says, I'm coming, it's just going to take me some time. He doesn't just mean literally, it takes me some time to get to you. He means it's going to take time for history to develop for our reunion to be complete. How much time? I don't know. Well, we know it's going to take about 3,000 years. But ultimately, according to the second interpretation of Rashi, the last verse of Ovadia represents the unity and the unification between the brothers. So that is a little bit of an introduction. There's much more to say as an introduction, but we have to. I see the time is running out, so we got to jump to the Haftorah itself. And in the meantime, if anyone wants to make any comments, go ahead.
Rabbi, does Jacob and Esau ever meet again anywhere else in the Torah besides?
No. This is their final meetup. They don't want to. They both understand that the tension between their relationship, and they prefer to be separate, even though they don't live that far apart. Because Jacob remains in Israel and maybe Egypt at the end of his life, the last 17 years. But for the next, For the next 22 years, Jacob is in Israel. Esau is not that far. It's I don't know how many miles it is. It can't be that far. It's probably a 3-hour drive, maybe less by car. So by camel, do the math.
So did Jacob's children ever meet up with, or Jacob's descendants meet up with Esau's descendants? Like his sons?
Not in the Torah. Not in the Torah. We do have a story, which is nice to read. I should pull it up. Let me put it up right now. We do have a story in the book of Numbers, when the Jewish people are coming back from Egypt. And they're coming up north. In other words, they're coming from Egypt to Israel, they're traveling north. But Esau is in the southern border of Israel. Edom is the southern border of Israel. It's like the hills of Eilat, like from Eilat back into Jordan. So they have to pass. They want to pass through Edom. Edom does not allow them to. So they have to go all the way around the detour and go way east, north, and then come west. So they have to take a big detour around the land of Esau. And the Jewish people are a little bit offended by that. And it's very interesting to look. I don't know if we have the time. Okay, let's do it. Why not? Let's be brave. Let's look at the verses for a moment just to see how that conversation, because you wanted to know where do we see the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob interacting. That's the only place in the 5 books of Moses where that happens. So then
Rabbi, I want to interrupt you. I want to interrupt you with another question just to give you more food for thought. When Isaac dies, does Jacob meet Esau?
According to the Medrash, yes.
They bury together, right?
According to the Medrash, yes. And it's a little bit of a tragic story, but according to the Medrash, the answer is yes. So let me pull this up and then we can talk about it. The Medrash says like this. The Medrash says that when they want to bury Jacob, not when Isaac dies, I'm sorry. When Isaac dies, I don't remember if it says exactly. I have to check. I plead my ignorance. I don't know. I have to check. But I'll just talk from memory. When Isaac dies, the story is that they want to bury Isaac in the cave of Machpelah. And what happens then is that Esau comes and protests and says there's only one grave left and it's my spot. And they get into a little bit of a fight, and Jacob's grandson kills Esau. Literally, I hate to be so violent so early in the morning, but literally beheads Esau. And Esau's head rolls, according to the Zohar, according to the Medrash, I think it's the Zohar, according to the Zohar, Esau's head rolls and lies next to his father Esau. And from the Kabbalistic perspective, that has a tremendous amount of significance. The reason that has so much significance is because the Kabbalah keeps telling us how Esau's source is very holy. We discussed it last week, we discussed it in the JLI. Esau's source is much holier than Jacob. The problem is that the way Esau manifests in this world, his divine potential becomes destructive instead of constructive, but his potential is much greater. So when you say Esau's head, it means Esau's source. Esau's source is next to Isaac. Esau's body is not next to Isaac. So that's that Medrash. Does it say anything about Isaac's passing? I don't remember this moment. I apologize. If anyone else wants to jump in about that, please do not hesitate to do so. Oh, I'm sorry. It says so explicitly, black on white in this week's parsha. I should know this. Vayigva Yitzchak Bayamat. This is in this week's parsha, chapter 35, verse 29. Esau, And Isaac expired and died, and he was gathered to his people, which means that's the description of going back. His soul goes back to heaven. Old and fulfilled in days, his son Esau and Jacob buried him. So he was there for the Shiva. He was there for your funeral. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, I just want to go for a moment. If you see here the story of when the Jewish people are coming back from Egypt. Okay, so here it goes. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, descendants of Esau. So says your brother Israel. You know all the hardship that has befallen us. Our fathers went down to Egypt, and we sojourned in Egypt for a long time, and the Egyptians mistreated us and our forefathers. We cried out to the Lord, and he heard our voice. He sent an angel, and he took us out of Egypt. And now we are in Kadesh, a city at the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your land. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink your water. We will walk along the king's road, and we will turn neither to the right nor to the left until we have passed through your territory. Right? It's coming, your brother. I just want to pass. I'm not going to make any trouble, and we're going to behave. Could we please pass your territory? But what's the key word? The key word is, so said your brother Israel. Ko amar achicha Yisrael. So says your brother Israel. The Jewish people consider themselves the brothers of Edom. In the response, verse 18, what does Edom say? Edom replied to him, you shall not pass through me, lest I go out towards you with the sword. He says, no, you can't come. I'm going to send my army to block you. No mention of brotherhood. So now the Jews try again. Verse 19, the children of Israel said to him, we will keep to the highway. And if we drink your water, either I or my cattle, we will pay its price. It is really nothing. I will pass through on foot. In other words, we're willing to pay for the water we drink. Let us pass. But he said, you shall not pass through. And Edom came out toward them with a vast force and with a strong hand. Edom refused to allow Israel to cross through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. Why did we ask twice? Someone tells you no, just leave. The guy said no, we ask again. So what the commentaries say is something fascinating. The first time we ask as a brother. Edom says, you're not my brother. I don't consider you my brother. So then what do? Then we ask like a stranger. Okay, so you don't let me buy because I'm your brother. Let me buy because I'm going to support your economy. Even that, Edom says no to. So what you see here is the tension between the two brothers and their descendants, and whether or not they consider themselves brothers. This plays out in the Torah later on. Now we jump a few hundred years to Ovadia because we have a lot to do and not a lot of time. So we'll read it and I'll try to give some commentary. And once we get to the point where things shift in verse 9, I'll try to point that out. Okay, the vision of Ovadia. Okay, before we even do that, another introduction. Ovadia is the only prophet, like I said earlier, that all he does is speaks to the kingdom of Edom. So the Talmud says that Ovadia is actually a convert of Edom. He was converted from Edom, becomes a Jew, and now his prophecy is directed toward Edom. He knows Edom more than anybody else because he comes from Edom. And the Talmud has a very interesting phrase in Aramaic. The Talmud says, from the forest itself, you take the wood to make the axe to chop the forest. In other words, if God wants to talk about the destruction of Edom, he uses Edom itself. And that's what the Talmud says. In the Kabbalah, the Hasidic philosophy, this is used to express the concept of itapcha, transformation, that the person from Edom himself could become the moral prophet who would speak to Edom and try to bring Edom back to the path of justice. That represents that Edom can transform completely to become a prophet just like Ovadia was. Okay, that's another introduction. Now we jump right in. The vision of Ovadia, so said the Lord concerning Edom. We have heard tidings from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Arise, let us rise up against them in war. In other words, there are messengers, there are many prophets that are going to talk about this and carry the message and tell the surrounding nations to go up in war against Edom. Behold, verse 2, behold, I have made you small among the nations. You are very despised. So Edom was not a very powerful and respected nation. However, they were very arrogant. Why were they so arrogant? We'll talk about that in verse 3. The wickedness of your heart enticed you, who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, who says to himself, who will bring me down to the earth? If you look at the land of Edom, it's their great mountains, and they have found caves in the mountains where the people would live. And because the people were high up in the mountains, surrounded by mountains, they felt invincible, and they felt that they are protected from any enemy. And if you Google a little bit, you would see that there are people who think they know exactly which mountains we're talking about in southern Jordan, and they say that that's where Edom lived, and because they felt so protected because of the topography, that is why they became so arrogant, and they think that they're never going to be attacked or invaded. Of course, that wasn't true. Eventually, they were attacked and invaded by Babylonia. Verse 4: if you go up high like an eagle, and if you place your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. So this represents the imagery of the eagle flies high. I'm putting my nest amongst the stars. That means they build their homes very high up in the mountains, and therefore they think that nobody is going to be able to overcome them. But God says, no, I will bring you down. Again, the message here is that to any nation or any kingdom, to understand that no nation will last forever, and there is always they always have to be humble and understand that they're not invincible. Now, verse 5 and 6 and 7 discuss and 8 discuss the downfall of Edom and how the downfall is going to be complete. Did thieves come upon you? Did plunderers of the night? How were you silent? Will they not steal till they have enough? If vintagers come upon you, will they not leave over some gleaning grapes? What the prophet is saying, the prophet is prophesying about a time that Edom will be utterly destroyed. And then the prophet says, why are you destroyed? Did a thief come to you? Even if a thief came to you, he wouldn't take everything. The thief just steals enough for the thief to need. The thief doesn't take everything. If the thief takes everything, it's because, in other words, the destruction of Edom will be even more than if thieves plundered them. And then the imagery, if vintagers come to you, somebody wants to come and take your wine, but at least they'll leave some olelot, some of the small grapes. But that wasn't the destruction of Edom. The story of destruction of Edom is complete destruction. How Esau was searched out, how its hidden things were revealed. In other words, even the hidden treasures of Esau will be revealed. Verse 7 discusses how the allies abandoned Edom. Until the border, all your allies escorted you. Your friends enticed you. Ye prevailed against you. Your food they lay as a wound under you. There is no discernment in them. In other words, they come to the border, but they don't pass the border to fight with you. Verse 8, shall I not in that day, says the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom and discernment from the mountain of Esau? In other words, the destruction is not just physical, it's also that their wisdom will be taken from them. Verse 9, and your mighty men shall be dismayed, O dwellers of the southland, in order that every man be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. That's the destruction. Now we start talking about history. So the prophet just got up and he said, you Edom, you are so arrogant. You think you're invincible. You need to know that ultimately destruction will reach you as well unless you shape up. That is a prophet. That is a similar prophecy that other prophets prophesied to Edom and to other nations. That theme is not so unique. But now we talk about the history. What's the problem here? What's the problem with Edom? Now we start talking about our family. So verse 10 goes back and verse 11 goes future. So let's read this. Let's follow this. Because of the violence of your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you and you shall be cut off forever. Machamas, they say violence, but machamas means robbery. And most commentaries explain what this means is that they hated the Jews. Why? Because they felt that they're the oldest son. But in reality, they stole that from Jacob. We're flipping it. I know we think we stole the blessings from Esau, but that's not exactly true from the Jewish perspective, because we know in the story that Esau sells his birthright to Jacob. So in other words, now when Jacob demands that he is the firstborn, that's stealing from his brother. Now again, verse 10, we start talking specifically how we are your brother and you should have treated us better. What are we referring to? We're referring to the fact the day Jerusalem was attacked, you were there and you rejoiced. That is very painful. And that's what we're going to discuss in verse 10, 11, 12. I'm sorry, 11, 12, and 13. And maybe if we have a chance, we'll look at the book of Psalms where there's a very famous Psalm, probably one of the most famous Psalms, that also makes mention of this concept. So let's see if we get to that. So let's read 11. On that day you stood from afar. On the day strangers captured his possessions, and foreigners came into his cities. And on the Jerusalem they cast lots. You too are like one of them. In other words, what's the problem? Edom is south of Israel. Edom should have been a natural ally to Jerusalem. And yet when the foreigners, strangers came in, which is talking about the future when Babylonia attacks Jerusalem and destroys Jerusalem, you're standing aside. You're standing on the side. It gets worse. Not only do they stand on the side, but verse 12 describes how they rejoice. Verse 12, and you should not have looked on the day of your brother on the day of his being delivered. And you should not have rejoiced about the children of Judah on the day of their destruction. And you should not have spoken proudly on the day of distress. So this is a much bigger problem than the beginning of the prophecy. Beginning of the prophecy, we say you're an arrogant nation. Okay, there's many, take a ticket. There are many nations who are arrogant. Here the problem, the pain of the Jewish people and the pain of the prophet is much more. You're our brother, you're our neighbor. You stood on the side of the day we were plundered, and to the contrary, you rejoiced. So now 13, we said you should not have come to watch the scene of our misfortune. Verse 13, you should not have come into the gate of my people on the day of their misfortune. You should not have looked at their affliction on the day of their misfortune, and you should not have stretched out your hand upon their possessions on the day of their misfortune. So this is even worse. Now, verse 13, you see the progression. Verse 11 means you stood on the side. Verse 12, you rejoiced. Verse 13, you participated in taking their possessions, in looting Judea and looting Jerusalem. Verse 14, and you should not have stood by the gap to cut off their fugitives, neither should you have delivered their survivors on the day of distress. This is even worse. When the fugitives of Judea ran to Edom, and Edom delivers them to the hand of the Babylonians. So this is a lot of pain. And now we go and talk about the punishment to Edom and ultimately the reunification. But before that, I want to look again at what I alluded to before, how King David in the book of Psalms prophesizes about something similar. And it's actually very beautiful. It's sad, but it's probably one of the most beautiful verses in the Psalms. So it's relatively well known. If I can just put up the Tanakh here. Scriptures. So we're talking about Tehillim 137, I think. Al Naharas Bavel. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. We also wept when we remembered Zion. This is very famous. We say it in the Grace After, as an introduction to the Grace After Meals every day. But it's a famous verse. Many people know it. There are many songs written about this, the scene of the Jewish people being exiled, and they're sitting on the rivers of Babylon when they remember Zion. On willows, on its mist, we hung our harps. In other words, the Jewish people, certainly the Levites, would sing music, but they hang up their harps on the willows. Why? Because they're in mourning. For there our captors asked us for words of song, and our tormentors asked of us mirth. Sing for us of the song of Zion. Right? The captors say, why don't you sing? So the psalm continues, how shall we sing the song of the Lord on foreign soil? And this is probably one of the most famous verses in the Bible, verse 5. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to its palate if I do not remember you, if I do not bring up Jerusalem at the beginning or the head of my joy. These are very, very powerful verses. Many things that we do in our practice is to commemorate these verses. For example, probably the most famous one is that at a chuppah, at a marriage, we break a glass. Why do we break a glass? To remember the destruction of the temple. Why do we remember the destruction of a temple at a wedding? That's the verse 6. If I do not bring up Jerusalem, meaning the memory of Jerusalem, at the height of my joy. So that's why we break the glass. At the height of the joy, which is a wedding, we remember Jerusalem. Now, why am I telling this to you? I'm telling this to you because we jump back to the story of Edom, verse 7. Remember, O Lord, for the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem. In other words, God, remember. We're not a vengeful people, but we're not a forgetful people. We remember what happens, and especially when the pain comes from a brother. So verse 7 reads, remember, O Lord, for the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem. What's the day of Jerusalem? The day of Jerusalem means the day of the destruction of Jerusalem. Those who said, raise it down to its foundation. In other words, the Edomites told the Babylonians, it's not enough to destroy the city. You have to destroy the city down to its foundation so it could not be rebuilt. Later, we'll talk about Babylon. We also ask God to punish the Babylonians who actually did the destruction. But in some way, Edom is more offensive than Babylon. Babylon is our enemies. Okay, they're our enemies. But that Edom participate and encourage Babylon to undermine Jerusalem and destroy it down to the foundation, including the foundation, that's so much more painful. So what we see here is this is a theme that reoccurs in the Tehillim in one of the most famous chapters in all Psalms. So I thought that was interesting to point that out. Now we're going to say, God says, now the prophet says, Edom, because of what they did, now they'll get the retribution. Verse 15, for the day of the Lord over all the nations is close. As you have done shall be done to you. Your recompense shall be returned upon your head. In other words, they will be punished. For as you drank on my holy mount, shall all the nations drink constantly, and they shall drink and be stunned, and they shall be as though they were not. So drinking means drinking the punishment. And on Mount Zion there shall be a remnant, and it shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall inherit those who inherited them. In other words, those people from Mount Zion will come back, and those who inherited the house of Jacob, now Jacob will inherit those who inherited them. And then we continue, and the house of Jacob shall be fire, and the house of Joseph as flame, and the house of Esau shall become stubble, and they shall ignite them and consume them, and the house of Esau shall not have no survivors, for the Lord has spoken. Very harsh. And the inhabitants of the southland shall inherit the mountain of Esau, and the inhabitants of the plain, the Philistines, and they shall inherit the field of Ephraim and the field of Samaria, and Benjamin with the inhabitants of Gilad. In other words, the Jewish people come back to Israel and inherit their neighbors. And this exiled host of Israel, this exiled host of the children of Israel who are with the Canaanites as far as Sarfat. What is Sarfat? It depends who you ask. The early commentators say Sarfat is a city in Lebanon. In modern Hebrew, Sarfat is France. Rashi lived in France. Rashi says Sarfat is France. So in other words, the exiled children of Israel who were exiled as far as France, and the exile of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad. So also Sepharad is a debate. It's either a city close to Israel, or Sepharad is what the Talmud calls Aspamia, which is Spain, because in modern Hebrew, Sepharad is Spain. And Rashi says Sepharad is Spain. So they're going to come back from Sarfat, from Ashkenaz, from Western Europe, and from Spain, and they're going to come back and inherit the cities of the Southlands. And finally, we get to the key. And according to the key, this is the reunion of Yaakov and Esau at the end of days, after all the animosity and pain and destruction between the two brothers. Savior shall ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esau, and the Lord shall have the kingdom. In other words, when will there be a reunion? When will people go from Mount Zion and judge Mount Esau? When will the two brothers become reunite? That is when Hashem, the kingdom will be Hashem in the Messianic era. In other words, what's happening here from the Kabbalistic perspective? The Kabbalistic perspective says ultimately God cannot be the ruler of the world just in Mount Zion. In other words, people from Zion have to go to Mount Seir before God can rule the world. In other words, Jacob and Esau represents both. Now, Jacob represents spirituality, and Esau represents the physical world, or the way the rabbis spell it out, Jacob represents the spirituality of Israel, and Esau represents the success of the Western society, which is Western sciences and Western technology. But ultimately, Mashiach can only come when there's a reunion between the two, and both the physical and the spiritual meet up, and they together become in the service of God. So in other words, the purpose of creation, when can God be the king of the entire earth? That will be when the physical and the spiritual can reunite within our own life. We have the harmony between the body and the soul, but between the world and as a whole, where the holiness and the spirituality of the Jewish people informs the science and technology of Esau, meaning the West, and together they can bring about the perfection in the world, and the kingdom will be Hashem's. So that's the story in short, the book of Ovadia. Congratulations, you've concluded an entire book of the Bible. So you can go home and say, we were so accomplished, we learned an entire book today. Don't tell anybody it was only 21 verses, but you did do the entire book. So give yourself a round of applause. If anybody has any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see each other, God willing, in good health.
Rabbi, how do we know that after 22 years, Esau was still harboring the revenge against Jacob?
We don't know. We don't know, because at that moment, the reunion was so emotional. Jacob, Esau cries, and Esau hugs, and Esau kisses, right? So Jacob is Esau is a very emotional person. And emotional people, if they're purely emotional, they can go to the extremes. So when they hate you, they want to kill you. And when they love you completely. So that moment was a very powerful reunion. I don't know what Esau wanted to do. I can't speak for Esau. But what I could do is speak for Jacob. Jacob is afraid that Esau, with all his passion and emotion, that's going to swing again. Whether or not it was justified is another question. But that's what Jacob is afraid. And that's why Jacob says, you know what? You go home. I'm coming soon. That doesn't tell you anything about Esau. That tells you about how Jacob sees Esau, which may or may not have been accurate. But certainly the way the rabbis see this is, if that reunion would be ultimately complete, that would spill over for the next generation. But you see clearly that Edom and the Jewish people are in conflict for many generations. In fact, going back to the prophecy of Rebecca is told by the prophet, you have two nations in your midst, and they're going to constantly struggle. One goes up, the other one goes down. And the rabbis understood that to mean the conflict between Jerusalem and Rome. In other words, even generations after the story we read today, the way we interpreted it as the destruction of the first temple, the rabbis think of it as the destruction of the second temple. In other words, we see that struggle between Yaakov and Esau. I don't know if they got along or they would have gotten along. They are individuals, but the energies that they represent are much greater even than those individuals. So Jacob represents spirituality, and Esau represents material success, and there is a conflict between them. Eventually, they're going to make peace. That's the story of the redemption. So I'm talking too much. For the direct answer to your question is, we don't know. If we know that there was a moment that there was intense reconciliation and emotion between the two brothers. If I'm Jacob, I'm afraid. I don't know how long this is going to last. This is an emotional person, and emotional people, their emotions swing. That's why he says, you know what? It's much better to have a brother a few hundred miles away, a few hundred kilometers away.
But Rashi quotes Rashi is talking about the tradition, saying that it's absolutely known that Esau still hated Yaakov.
Okay, so we can talk about that Rashi tomorrow, but the bottom line is this. In general, the starting point, Rashi says, is that they are in conflict. But still, Rashi himself says that at that moment was an exception.
Right.
Okay?
That's
so
why the dots are there.
I'm sorry?
That's why the dots are over the word.
That's why the dots mean exception. The question is, what's the exception? We can elaborate upon this tomorrow. But the bottom line is that most people say, the other people say it wasn't sincere. But others say that kiss, that moment, that hug was actually sincere. But the energies are greater than these two people. In other words, they are set up for conflict. They're so different and what they value, their value system is so different. The way they see the world is so different. They're destined to unfortunately, the story of the history of the Jewish people, but the history of the world represents the play out of this conflict. And ultimately, this is a very important verse. Verse 21 is a very important verse. That's why we say it every day in the prayer. Every single day of the year, we say it in the prayer. God cannot be the king of the world until people from Zion go to Mount Seir. In other words, until Jerusalem affects the West. If you want to talk about the broader question, until the spiritual affects the physical, then Mashiach can come. Then God can reign king. So in other words, we're saying, like Rashi says, when Jacob says, "I'm coming," he is coming. When is he coming? He's coming in a few thousand years, but he is coming. So, but the good news is we're a few thousand years closer. So we're getting there. And you see this in this world today where the values of Judaism through Christianity and through other means have in fact impacted the spiritual descendants of Rome, which is Western Europe. And we're moving in that direction in great leaps and bounds. So we're almost at the time, hopefully speedily in our days, we'll have the full transformation and the full reunion between Jacob and Esau, body and soul, spirituality, and the physical sciences. So that's the story in short. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.